ruling class down in Bolivia. They monopolized all the resources and used unrelenting violence to enforce their misrule. But with Evo Morales' rise in Bolivian politics, the Blancos were being reminded that there were other people in Bolivia besides themselves, and they didn't like being reminded of that at all. And they definitely hated it when Evo Morales became president. And the Blancos weren't alone. Almost as soon as Morales was sworn into office, the white media began a steady drumbeat of anti-Morales hit pieces, questioning every decision that he made, questioning his legitimacy, casting aspersions on him and his party. The white supremacists in Bolivia and the U.S. saw Evo Morales as a threat that needed to be eliminated immediately. And why was that? Under Evo Morales' leadership, Bolivia's poverty fell by 42%. And the country's extreme poverty dropped by 60%. It's the same kind of improvements that Venezuela saw when Hugo Chavez took over and the white ruling class was forced out of power. So the US and the Blanco elites began plotting how to remove Evo Morales. When Morales moved to run for a fourth term as president, they felt that this could give them an opening. Their chosen narrative, which surely came out of Washington, was that after 14 years, the people of Bolivia were tired of Evo Morales. They just wanted him out. He had been in power too long. So the Blancos contested the outcome of the election, saying that there had been massive voter fraud. Gee, why does that sound familiar? They offered no proof whatsoever, by the way. They just kept claiming over and over again that there had been voter fraud. Because why would anyone not want the white elite back in charge? The primary rhetorical justification the Bolivian coup plotters used to justify overthrowing the government was a so-called report put out by the Organization of American States. The so-called OAS proclaims itself to be only interested in peace and justice among member states. But the U.S. is a member of this group, and the organization is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And for an organization that's only interested in peace and justice in its member states, where the hell have they been out the last 120 years as black people have been systematically brutalized here? I hadn't heard of this group before the coup in Bolivia, and yet this previously unknown organization put out a single report claiming widespread election irregularities, and that became the basis for overthrowing the Bolivian government. And this isn't simply my opinion. Even the New York Times had to admit that the OAS report was the main propaganda tool used to question Morales' election victory, and that the OAS report had serious flaws. But of course, the coup plotters had long since already driven Morales from office by then. All right then, so how did they do it? How did they overthrow the government? The Blanco racists then used their money to pay AstroTurf protesters to whine and complain in the streets on their behalf. But it's who was in the streets that's important. Now, as I mentioned before, Evo Morales happens to be Indio, that's part of the indigenous Indian group, and they've been historically locked out of politics in that region. Ever since he won office, his very presence in the presidency has infuriated the white elites, who had long said that they would get him out no matter what, because they wouldn't suffer the humiliation of allowing a non-white to be in control of their country. Second thing to remember, Bolivia has almost 12 million people. So when you see a rally with 25,000 people in the street, that's nothing, especially not when it's in the capital. But the white media didn't say anything about the unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud in Bolivia. Instead, they said the opposite, that it was proof that Morales was just another banana dictator. The white media took the side of the Blanco insurrectionists. They said absolutely nothing about the blatantly AstroTurf nature of the protest against Morales, or how much smaller those fake protests were compared to Morales' own supporters' rallies. The white media wasn't reporting the news, they were pushing a narrative because they wanted Morales out. Take NPR, for example. What NPR wrote is a pack of lies. This is literally government propaganda, but then again, what do you expect from a white media outlet called National Public Radio? The protests that this Penoranda character wrote about were not about the will of the people at all. They were deliberate acts of political violence meant to create chaos and disrupt the political process. In Latin America, they have protests the same way people in the US have music concerts. It's part of the culture there. People can be induced to take to the streets for anything or nothing at all. What matters is how many of them take to the streets. In the days following the invasion of Iraq, the white media tried to make it seem like every Iraqi in that country was celebrating Saddam Hussein's ouster. But as we found out in the days following, that wasn't true at all. In Latin America, it's easy to get 5 or 10,000 people to march for something, especially when it's the Blanco elites who are paying people to do so. Keep in mind, those countries down there have all had various wars and civil conflicts. Their militias and paramilitary groups are still very much active. And who do you think paid for those militias and paramilitaries? Not the poor peasants who Evo Morales represented, but the Blanco ruling class of Latin America could, especially with the financial backing of the United States. The question nobody thought to ask is how many of those alleged protesters in Bolivia, who the white media constantly talked about, were in fact members of those Latin American death squads? How many were members of those militias and paramilitaries? We've seen this in the United States, from the storming of the US Capitol to the takeover of the Michigan State House in 2020. These protesters were in fact militias. The authorities did nothing to stop them. They in fact went out of their way not to impede them. So these criminals were being protected by the government and allowed to run wild, threatening the lives of law-abiding citizens. The government made it clear they weren't going to do anything and the citizens would have to fend for themselves. The Blanco elites also had a few military individuals who were going to be backing them as well. So between the violence in the streets and the intimations of violence from the military, Morales fled the country and took refuge in Mexico because the white ruling class, who had misruled Bolivia like they did in Venezuela before Chavez took over, were attacking and even murdering Morales' supporters, threatening the lives of Morales' political allies and members of his political party. They were trying to purge Morales' party out of existence, scare people into disavowing being part of the party, and kill the ones who refused to be intimidated. And these coup plotters wanted to make it clear that their overthrow of the government was purely racial. They put out all kinds of racist and anti-indigenous language, according to Harvard Law School's own International Human Rights Clinic and the University Network for Human Rights. The woman who the CIA, the Bolivian coup plotters, chose to be their front person was Janine Áñez, who at that time had been the vice president of the Bolivian Senate. She wasn't even vice president of the country or Speaker of the Assembly. She was the fifth person down from the president, but Áñez was the highest ranking Blanco they could find and politically reliable to U.S. power, so that's how she got put at the front of the pack. She didn't get elected, and she didn't even pretend as if she had. She just got on TV and declared that she was proclaiming herself to be president of Bolivia. No vice president or anything. She didn't need to have any of those people in the way. She was going to have herself a unitary executive. She would just rule by fiat. She just put on her presidential sash and declared that she was officially in charge. And of course, the United States immediately recognized her as Bolivia's rightful leader. Nothing about being concerned about the fall of democracy, about how she seized power. Nothing about how the U.S. needed to wait and see what happened. None of the usual denunciations that the U.S. throws at governments that it doesn't like. The self-appointed dictator Áñez immediately had the police and military begin persecuting and even killing people who disagreed with her. The people of Bolivia saw the same repression and violence that had been going on before Morales come back with a vengeance. But the white media didn't say anything about it. The same white media that was celebrating the end of Morales' rule didn't say anything about the violence that had followed, because the coup plotters' campaign of terror and violence serves white supremacy's interests. Now, some of you may say that's a totalitarian takeover, but the white media said democracy had finally come to Bolivia. Who needs to listen to the voters? They don't know what's good for them, otherwise they would never have elected that indigenous guy so many times. Who needs the ballot box, right? Well, as it turned out, just like with the coup against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which happened much the same way, the people of Bolivia also made it clear they needed democracy, because only a year after the coup, Janine Áñez had to run for re-election. I guess she was thinking that the power of incumbency would keep her in there, or at least get her enough votes where they could lie and claim that they won, but instead she got blown out, losing by 20 percentage points to Luis Arce, who had been Evo Morales' finance minister. And not only did Morales' party retake the presidency, but his party gained seats in the Bolivian Congress. Morales, by this time, was no longer in Mexico. He was now in Argentina, which is right on the border with Bolivia, and Morales was among the first people to celebrate his finance minister's victory. And a few weeks later, almost exactly a year after leaving the country, Evo Morales came back in November 2020. But while he was treated to a hero's welcome at home, the white media in the US haven't been so eager to report on that. They gave the occasional passing mention to it, but whereas it was practically front page news 3 years ago, now it's being treated as just another international news snippet. Maybe that's because the coup plotters have found themselves forced to flee. Well, the ones who could anyway. And what has become of the coup plotters? Janine Áñez was arrested, along with a number of her co-conspirators. She's been charged with genocide due to the dozens of Bolivians who were killed on her orders by the police after the coup she carried out. She and her pals were trying to solidify their grip on power, and the people who refused to accept the reimposition of Blanco rule were being gunned down. At last report, Janine Áñez made a suicide attempt. The New York Slimes puts their spin on it to justify the coup and claim this is nothing more than settling old scores. Gee, is that what they said about Iraq after the US knocked off that government? They start off by saying that Áñez is accused of terrorism and sedition. The Washington Post, where the Organization of American States is based, basically cuts and pastes the exact same talking points. But even they had to admit that the OAS reported evidence of massacres, systematic torture, and summary executions by security forces under Áñez's interim government. They also admit that Áñez herself signed a decree giving the police and military amnesty for whatever actions they take. Giving these guys a license to kill is what it was. So she was telling them to kill, torture, rape, brutalize whomever you want, and you won't be prosecuted. And considering that so many in the police and military are Blancos or Blanco collaborators, she was basically giving her fellow coup plotters permission to kill, which they did. People didn't simply die following the coup, like the white media says. They were being murdered on the government's orders. And don't let it surprise you that the OAS admitted to the atrocities carried out by the Blanco dictators in Bolivia. They didn't have any real support for that coup. The people of Bolivia had made it clear they were with Morales. Latin countries like Mexico and Argentina had given Morales refuge, so the US couldn't have him killed like they did Hugo Chavez. The white media had to change their reporting on police murders as public sentiment changed, and these juries started convicting these cops, and these white power control apparatuses like the OAS were forced to change their tune as well. When one of their lies falls, they'll bust a 180 fast to try to maintain some semblance of credibility. Same way the white media said that stop and frisk hadn't hurt Bloomberg's standing among black voters when he was running for president. And then when black voters in Alabama literally turned their backs on him, that same white media didn't about face so fast you get whiplash just reading the articles. White supremacy believes in adapting, folks. So don't think the Washington Post wanted to report these facts. They didn't. But at least the Post did mention it right before they give Áñez's supporters tons of page space to offer excuses and rationalizations and pretend that this is just Morales' political pals settling old scores. They quote one guy from Human Rights Watch, of all places, who literally said they were afraid RC would selectively use the report to strengthen his political interests while ignoring abuses by his own supporters. Human Rights Watch's own spokesperson said, "But what about them?" It wasn't until almost the bottom of the article that the Post gives a blink and you'll miss it mention to the fact that when Janine Áñez was dictator of Bolivia, she had her regime's prosecutors pursuing terrorism charges against Morales, even though he was in exile. Don't remember the white media or Human Rights Watch or OAS or anyone else complaining about that. No mention of that being revenge by the group in power. The New York Times piece doesn't mention the genocide charge at all. No mention of the 20 people murdered by the police as the coup plotters wanted to solidify their grip on power. They simply make one vague mention of deadly protests and one vague mention of violence after the election, but the New York Times doesn't give any information. They word it in a way to lead the reader to think it was just angry people fighting each other, and it wasn't directed, orchestrated political racial violence being carried out by Inez and her coup plotters against the people of Bolivia. This is the New York Times, all the lies that are fit to print. The Times mentions the word coup only once in their entire propaganda piece. And even then, they try to sanitize it by saying that people called it a coup. Yeah, that's just what people called it. Because apparently the Times doesn't know what a coup is. Unless someone tries it in the US, then they suddenly are able to determine exactly what it is. Both the Times and the Post are pushing a narrative meant to justify the coup, but they go beyond that and claim that there was no reason to have Inez arrested. The Times just came straight out and began advocating for her, saying that she was no longer a political threat, that since the coup she had run for governor of some state and she had lost that election too, and that newly installed President Arce was only prosecuting Inez because his party had lost a mayoral race in some town somewhere, and they also wanted to distract the public from how poorly their government was handling the coronavirus outbreak. So the white media is recycling the same talking points they used against Evo Morales. Arce's government is ineffective, corrupt, using the judiciary to go after political adversaries. Apparently, they never mentioned what Janine Áñez and her cohorts were doing. The U.S. wanted Morales out, and they wanted him out badly. And why is that? What makes Bolivia so important to the United States? The country doesn't have oil or gold or natural reserves. They're not strategically located. So why put all this effort into capturing it? Because Bolivia sits on the world's largest lithium reserves. There's so much of it, it looks like the North Pole down there. Lithium, as you know, is the primary component for rechargeable batteries. You're not going to have any kind of green revolution without lithium. Now, every tech company from Apple to Google uses it, but there's one person in particular who needs lithium more than anyone else just to survive. Elon Musk, who was not at all bashful about wanting to control Bolivia's lithium reserves. This is a real tweet, by the way, which I'll bet 99% of you hadn't even heard of it. First of all, it's asinine for a billionaire who makes his money off of the fact that the government usually invests in the stuff that he wants to do. He deals in highly government regulated industries, which gives him a leg up. And first he's complaining, saying that a stimulus package isn't in the best interest of the people. Somebody points out, hey, the coups that guys like you are helping to organize so you can get your hands on people's lithium and steal it, that's not in anyone's best interest either. And what does Elon Musk say? He says, we will coup whoever we want. Deal with it. Family, you can't make this up. That lets you know exactly how secure this little scumbag thinks his position is. He thinks his position is so secure, he can come right out and tell you, heck yeah, I'm behind it. What you going to do about it? Typically, these clowns who organize these coups just stay in the background. But in the case of Elon Musk, he's sitting here thinking to himself, heck, the world's going to be depending on what it is that I'm doing. I'm going to be the richest man in history. I can just go ahead and tweet what I'm doing. I can go ahead and say, heck yeah, we're cooing people, we're overthrowing governments, and you can't do nothing about it. So you see how that event way down there in Bolivia is directly connected to the United States. The point that I'm trying to impress upon you is that white supremacy is a global system, and it uses the same tricks all over the world. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. Malcolm talked about that, because what the white supremacist sees as a solution, we understand to be a problem. White supremacy is about creating power imbalances where previously none existed. It's about using lies, manipulation, and most of all, overwhelming violence to manufacture a condition that advantages white control. In a circumstance like that, you cannot have justice. You cannot have democracy. The United States has never had democracy for a single moment of its existence, which is why you got these clowns from the Congressional Black Talkers and the NAACP who make themselves look like total idiots talking about, we almost lost our democracy. Democracy hangs in the balance. You can't lose what you never had, stupid. You want to talk about balance? Justice is balance. Balance is an immutable law of the universe. Nature abhors a vacuum. Every scientist knows that. But under white supremacy, you must create power vacuums. This gives white supremacy an opening so they can take over, but it also creates conditions and circumstances of deprivation and lack of resources meant to keep the people they're oppressing from being able to oppose them. It's a self-perpetuating machine. That's why I selected Bolivia as a little case study, just to show you yet another example of how you have the enforcement arm of white supremacy, the military and the police, working hand in hand with the administrative arm of white supremacy, that is a corrupt government, whether they overthrew the current regime or not, and of course the propaganda arm of white supremacy, the white media, who decides what they will and will not report on, and then how they're going to cover it. And let's not forget about the white corporations that are making a killing off of all of this murder. Doesn't matter where white supremacy operates, doesn't matter what language it chooses. Morality can come in 1,000 different forms, but evil always looks exactly the same. Good day and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Bobby Williams, John Harvin, Gregory Franklin, Starlet Thompson, and Deep Eye 904. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.